Hi there, I'm Marcus. I guess Udine has already introduced me. Hi Udine, miss you. Well, she has invited me to talk briefly about detective stories, and that's why I've chosen this street, this creepy street, which seems to be an ideal scenario for a crime scene. Of course, I'm kidding. This is quite safe now here, but just try to imagine this street back to the 18th century, and without all of these tourists, of course, and darkness, and with few people walking around. It's just perfect for a crime scene because it's totally urban scene. It's a totally urban and new by that time for who dare to walk alone in this street. Actually, one of these houses reminds us a lot of the murder at Rue Morgue. The house was probably pretty like this. So, talk about detective fiction, it would be not possible before 18th century, and I will try to explain why. So, in the late 18th and early 19th century, the urban centers were still slightly new, and then to be among the crowd was not only a reason to excitement, but also a perfect way to be anonymous. And to be anonymous for one who intends to commit any kind of crime is just perfect because it can be disguised among this crowd of people. Perfect. And then another contribution from the 19th century, 18th, 19th century to detective fiction is its scientific thinking, which starts to grow faster, especially in the 19th century, but it already had come from the Industrial Revolution. And what does it have to do with detective fiction? The fact that science is the base of the detective methodology, which means the detective works by using the intellect. That's why Dupin, the Edgar Allan Poe's detective, is considered a machine of thinking. And also Sherlock Holmes and Poirot and Mrs. Marple from Agatha Christie. So this is one of the main contribution from historical time to literary world of detective fiction, which is this scientific, this rationalism, which came from the positivism. And what is exactly the contribution? To begin with, this structure. The structure of fiction, detective fiction, is kind of predictable. As predictable is the way of thinking the rationalists, because they want to experiment, they want to test things to reach a hypothetical solution. So in terms of scientific thinking, life is predictable because you can prove it by science. And then the same way is the structure of detective fiction. At least the first age of detective fiction, which is considered to be the golden age, the one in which Edgar Allan Poe, Sir Conan Doyle, Agatha Christie, for instance, start to develop their writings. The important thing to say is that Edgar Allan Poe was not the creator of detective fiction, because there used to be other kinds of crime narrative, but he developed the genre as the way we know nowadays, which is based on this scientific approach. Now we move on to the second, let's call that, the second generation of detective fiction, which goes from Europe to United States. I'm referring to the noir detective fiction, which is the hard-boiled detective. The hard-boiled detective starts to appear in literature from the 30th to 40th decades, already in the 20th century. And this detective, this character, is different. You can distinguish him or her from the first generation, the Golden Age generation, because this detective changed his methodology or her methodology in the same way that changed the equipment. This detective doesn't use the magnifying glass anymore, but he or her or she replaces it for a gun, because we are talking about a new context, a context in which violence is growing and growing fast, the same way that science grew fast against religion myths in the beginning of the 20th and the 19th century. But this time, the crime is not committed by an anonymous person anymore, but by a gangster. And so I'm talking about the organized crime. And to deal with organized crime, the detective has to change him or herself, becomes more violent too. For instance, if the first generation, the detective would solve the solution, solve the crime, finds the solution without any harm, without any injury, in the noir detective, it becomes different. In fact, the detective also gets him or herself involved in fights and sometimes almost die. So this approach is much more realistic if we consider the urban scenery sorry, and the new context of modernity. So these differences allow me to list one or two main characteristics of the new the detective. And I say new, I'm talking about this second generation, which is the hard-boiled, the noir detective. And then the other difference is that the hard-boiled detective, the noir one, the noir detective, starts to deal with two words. The one which is the accepted society, the urban context, and the other one which is the outskirts. So in other words, he or she has to deal with bad guys as contacts too. So his ethics are put in question. The first difference between the hard-boiled to the first generation detectives like Dupin or Sherlock Holmes is that the narrator is not his partner anymore. Which is curious, because if you think about the first generation, for instance, that the detective's struggle, the detective's quest was for truth. So the truth was the main reason for the detective's action. And the question is, which truth is that, right? If it's the truth of the crowd or the truth of the hegemonic powers, right? So there is an ideological implication here. But anyway, the kind of narrative and the position of the narrator is different. As I said, in the first generation is the partner who describes, who narrates the detective's adventures, like Watson and other ones. But when you talk about the second generation, which is the noir detective, the narrative is now doing by the detective himself or herself, which is a questionable perspective, because it's kind of the first person, and we know that narrative in the first person is not trustable, which is funny because as the idea is construct a narrative following the truth or seeking the truth, we can notice now that in either way, the first one or the second generation, the truth is something not trustable, not reliable, right? Well, the second difference is that the detective hard-boiled, the detective noir, now can suffer the consequences of his investigations, of his adventures, which didn't happen with Sherlock Holmes, for instance, because he didn't have any kind of harm and injury. Now let's talk about the third example of the unfolding genre detective fiction, which is the anti-detective, and the one I like the most, because it's not only because it's a contemporary example of the narrative of fiction, detective fiction, but because this one makes us think more appropriately about our time, our context, and is more explicitly the critique it does, at least in my reading, of society and the contemporary times. Because first, the anti-detective starts exactly the same as the traditional, the classical genre, which means there is a detective who seeks for truth and goes in adventure to find a solution of a crime or some mystery. However, and that is the most interesting thing, in this search for the truth, the detective lost himself. He gets lost not only from the tracks, from the clues and his investigation, but in the process of investigation, he starts to go into a kind of existentialist thinking. He starts to question himself and his identity and his position in society, and as a metaphor for what's happening in this relationship between the hegemonic powers in society. So, if the detective, the anti-detective, critiques the existence of an absolute truth, a final truth, it implies that all truths are questionable. So this is very important if you think about society in itself. If you think about laws, if you think about rules as something unchangeable, some immutable track, immutable feeling, and then the revolutionary aspect of that is that you start to question why something is that way and not in another, and not in another way. For me, this is one of very important conquests of this new approach of detective fiction. For instance, there is a very nice work I'd like to quote here, which is The City of Glass by Paul Auster. In this story, the character, the main character, the protagonist, which is Queen, starts to follow clues for suspects of crime, but he does it because he writes fiction. He writes detective fiction, so he trusts in his ability of a writer, and the close, the predictable structure of his genre to follow, to play a role. Sorry, there was a fly. To play a role of detective in his real world, and then it is the moment that two situations are confronted. This original belief, this classical belief in the predictable world and scientific thinking and sciences in general, against the unpredictability of events, which is real life. And then starting to question this predictability, he is questioning not only scientific thinking, but all paradigm, all structure that imposes for us how things must be like, and starts to question what is real, the real life like. So the anti-detective is this, is a detective in the fiction, is the detective who, in the seeking truth, starts to find questions instead of answers. And the main power of this kind of narrative is that makes us thinking about this fixed structure of society, the imposition of certain rules, and start to question also in literature the tradition of detective fiction, because the author, in this case Paul Auster, who is the author of City of Glass, puts in check the tradition of writing, this writing structural way of it used to be done. Then the protagonist of anti-detective stories deconstruct this notion of reality, a kind of fixed, immutable reality, in deconstructing the structure of narrative, which means the detective won't find any solution but only questions when the narrative gets into its end. And also when the protagonist lost himself from himself. When the protagonist has this identity crisis, which is like, we don't born, grow, reproduce, and die in the same way. We are always changing. And we are changing by the relationships we construct, we develop along with our lives. In social context, in emotional context, in affective context, in any context, we are always changing. And this is very revolutionary if you compare with the way in the first generation, second generation, the detectives used to think about reality, think about their reality and the world as a predictable place to live. I mean, I think this is the way anti-detectives start to change perspectives when you have contact with them. So, summarizing. First, we have the first generation, which is the Gold Age detective fiction, in which we have as well-known writers Edgar Allan Poe, Sir Conan Doyle, Agatha Christie, just to cite some, to quote the most important ones. And they are detectives. Dupin by Edgar Allan Poe, Sherlock Holmes by Sir Conan Doyle, and Poirot or Mrs. Mabel by Agatha Christie. And this generation, these detective fictions produced in that time had as characteristic a detective obsessed by the truth and who used to be based on scientific thinking, because the time was when the science was really strong and growing stronger and stronger against myths of religion. And then we have, and then it used to be in the end of 18th, along with 19th century, in the beginning of 20th century. In the 20th century, 13th and 14th decades, another genre raised, which was the noir detective, the hard-boiled detective, with the contribution of a changing of perspective in the narrative, and the vulnerability of the detective, which I explained earlier, which is he starts to suffer some injuries and so on. And then finally, in the contemporary times, we find a detective which will put in question all the truth and beliefs from these two previous ones, which in fact is just being more clearer and more specific about this, at least this kind of relation with truth. Because in the last generation, the contemporary one, it's not, the truth is not the question anymore. The truth is put in question, which was veiled in the first, the second generation, subtlety, in a subtle way, because the detective, as I told you, since the beginning, was not dealing with truth in the narrative, in the way of narrating, because it was either his partner who was telling us the stories, and then obviously from another perspective than that the detectives. And the second generation is a narrative by the first person, which means, as you know, it's not trustable. So what happens is that in the third generation, in the anti-detective, we assume that this truth is not possible. I mean, the truth is a matter of perspective or point of view, which is, in fact, in our reality, especially in ideological way of thinking, as we are, attesting in the, WhatsApp information, for example, and the media information too. So guys, I'm sorry my so didactic way of speaking, and if I had made some confusion, but I hope I had helped you to understand a little bit better the detective fiction. So have a nice day, a nice class. We are with a really nice professor, which is Ivni. See you guys.